Welcome to the Integrate This EdTech podcast. Today we are joined by Stephen Baule, Associate Professor in Leadership Education, Director of K-12 Administrative Licensing Programs, and Director of the Educational Doctorate Program at Winona State University. Steve served as a district leader for 19 years and a building leader for 5. Originally a social studies teacher, he regularly presents on educational technology and leadership topics. He has authored over 250 publications spanning educational technology, history, libraries, and leadership. Steve holds a PhD in educational leadership and supervision and has received numerous honors from the American Association of School Librarians, the National School Boards Association, Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, the state of Illinois, and the U.S. Navy for his contributions. He was awarded the Van Miller Distinguished Scholar Practitioner Award by the University of Illinois, named one of eSchool News' top 10 tech-savvy superintendents, and recognized as a #future-ready superintendent by President Obama. Steve, we are thrilled to have you join us on the podcast and look forward to hearing your experiences and insights on the future of education.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, Steve, we really appreciate you taking some time out of your day and joining us here to hopefully have a great conversation around technology and education. And we look forward to kind of having the opportunity to maybe see you again this summer at a conference that David is going to present at, or that David is organizing. But boy, that was quite the impressive list of things that David just rattled off there. But let's kind of take you a little back before all of those things, right? What has inspired you to kind of take on the hat and the role of an educator?
Well, as a kid, I always wanted to be a history teacher, right? That was always kind of one of my original plans. And so, I joined the Army in part to pay for school, in part because my father had been in the service. And so I wanted to serve as well. And it's, when you look at that, when I was in college and high school, I wasn't necessarily a huge technology person. We had computers and the Apple IIs and all that sort of stuff, and didn't do much for me. But when I went through the infantry mortar platoon officers course at Fort Benning, and they started giving us the mortar ballistic computer to use, I'm figuring, oh, wow, if they're going to give technology to infantrymen, it is time to learn something about technology, right? And so between that and the instructional design courses at the University of Iowa that I took as part of my master's, that kind of drove me then into the instructional technology world. And I ended up getting a doctorate in education in instructional technology from Northern Illinois, and really saw, hey, this is the way the future is coming. We've been doing that for a long time, right? Every new technology is going to solve the world's problems. I particularly like it when, Thomas Edison and McCluskey talked about the fact that by the end of the 1920s, they'd have to use the Army to keep these kids out of school at night, because they were going to just be so excited for educational film that, they wouldn't be able to just go home. They'd have to stay there, and that would get rid of all textbooks. So we've heard this a couple of times before, but it never, there's always a little more balance there about where we go with technology. And that's the key, I think, is keeping some sort of balance there.
And sometimes it's just the tool then that kind of changes, right? It was film at one time, it's calculator, another time. And now maybe it's a little bit even more AI. But there's always kind of this build up, this anticipation, I think, that comes with that.
I think it is. It's because it's new, right? It's the, the hype cycle. We're all excited about it. It's to solve the world's problems, and then we kind of go down and it kind of levels off. And we just have to realize that's a constant sort of in our society today.
And Steve, so like for our region, Jeremy's in a different region than myself, but we both work with a lot of different schools. And so typically, like, I work with a lot of superintendents, for example, and I always feel like each school and superintendent approaches things differently in a variety of areas, right? But even, for my purposes and what I'm helping them with, tech integration is always approached differently. And some are much more, maybe more inclined to adopt some technology innovations, and some maybe not so much. so for you, when you were the superintendent, and you had those accolades that came about, like the tech savvy superintendent, what were the things that you were doing with tech integration at the district level that kind of earned you those accolades, or how did you approach it?
Well, I think the approach is really the most important thing, right? And it's the issue of stepping back and make sure that there's, for everything that you're doing, there is an instructional or an administrative imperative, right? When I was a assistant soup for technology or tech director before that, every time a new tool would come out, you get people going, "Hey, I got to have this," and people would occasionally be, "Well, why aren't you excited about it?" I said, "Well, I haven't figured out how we're going to use it instructionally yet," right? And so, you got to focus on what's the actual mission of the organization, which is, generally speaking, to provide efficient and effective instruction, right? And so everything should drive towards that. My very first tech plan ever just asked two questions. Basically, what would you like to do with your students right now that you can't? And then what are the administrative processes that currently impact your ability to focus on instructional things, right? And teachers responded. And one thing, I was lucky, I always got good response rates from the surveys that I did, and I still survey people a lot. You've all probably gotten surveys from me recently about, AI and education. But after I did the survey, I would always feed the information that we gathered back to the staff, and so that they would be able to see it and see that we were actually going to work and move forward based on their feedback. And I think that was always very helpful, because I'd have other administrators going, I survey people, they don't respond. I'm like, well, we work really hard to say, hey, thank you for your information. This is how we're going to use it. But that key is having that ability there to really, say, this is what we're doing, and have a plan. Make sure everybody knows what the plan is, and make sure that there's a roadmap that everybody can kind of follow.
Yeah, it seems like you're kind of, being very transparent with the direction that you're going, but also very intentional, right? And I think if people are able to see, where you're trying to get to, and the path and the steps that it takes to get there, I think that really helps to bring those people on board. So, would you say that then is a key thing to help kind of build those initiatives successfully, to help scale technology within a district, to get the buy-in from, the concerned groups, the stakeholders that are going to be affected by its outcomes?
Well, yes. And you always want to, if possible, especially at senior leadership levels, be very clear, set goals up front. So for instance, when we went to one-to-one devices, a little over a decade ago, I gave the teachers who were going to be the pilot group about an 18-month window, right? And said, hey, here's what we're planning. I had already had the IT folks kind of doing their work to make sure that, we were going to have the necessary bandwidth improved and things like that, so that by the time we actually got there, they'd had, a good 6 months of experience working with the devices in class sets and other ways. They'd had the PD they wanted. They'd been able to go to conferences. And with the board, we'd been very clear, hey, these are what our expectations are. Because if you don't set your expectations up front, then no matter how it ends up, people are going to spin it one way or the other, right? Either, oh, that was great, you had 70% improvement. Well, we were looking for 80, right? And so you have to have kind of very clear goals right up front of how you're going to measure things too, I think helps. But the more time frame you can give them, and I know other districts where the IT director found out they were going to go to one-to-one when the iPads actually showed up on the loading dock, because the superintendent wanted to say, hey, we have one-to-one devices, but there'd been absolutely no planning involved. And obviously that was not a successful iteration, right? That the planning is just essential.
I think I came from an experience similar to what you described, right? And our district was talking about going, and this was when I was back in the classroom, and our district was talking about going one-to-one iPads also. And it was very much a process of where teachers, I think I had the device myself because I was asked to be one of those leaders, the ones that are going to help drive the the learning that the staff will need to go through first. And I probably had it about 18 months before a student ever touched one. And then after I had it for about a half a year, then that one following school year, it went to all of the different staff got it, and they got, adept at using them. And I think at the same time, finding the way that it will become that instructional tool, not just, hey, we want to rush to get these in to people's hands because it's the latest fad, but, trying to find ways to prep the staff, make sure they're ready, and then, it'll be a much more seamless and successful rollout to students. Not that there's not going to be bumps and things you're going to have to adjust to along the way, but I think it became the blueprint that I think others tried to follow as well.
Yeah, no, there are always going to be bumps along the road, right? With any plan. And so the key there is just making sure that as you do it, you have a good process for who's going to intervene, right? Who to go for help.
Yeah, and I think listening to some of the stuff that you had mentioned, Steve, about getting the perspectives of your staff, I think are extremely important now, particularly with AI. And we do a lot of trainings on AI, over the last couple of years here. And that's another area, again, where you have, everybody's kind of in a different spot in terms of their adoption, whether it be the district itself or just even individual teachers. And so I think those are extremely important things. So if we shift a little bit into EdTech trends and digital literacy, if you look at the way that AI has come about and has evolved in the last just year to 2 years here, and you're looking at K through 12 education, what, from your perspective, what are the biggest shifts that you've seen in technology and how it's integrated in those areas, both of AI and digital tools?
Well, the simplest thing is it's no longer supplemental, right? I mean, historically, technology was sort of supplemental to the core textbooks. It's now core to the instructional process, or hopefully it is, right? I had an English teacher tell me a long time ago when I was an assistant principal that basically, if we were a primitive tribe, I'd be the witch doctor. I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, right? I think it was a good thing. But we've progressed to the speed that, things continue to change. The Tech and Learning, news feed that I get every morning had like 3 articles about general things and then 6 different things about AI, because that's like the number one thing everybody's trying to learn. In AI is a tool, and it's a set of tools, right? And we're at the very beginning of that. If you look at like the 5 tiers of potential AI, we're not even really at tier 2 yet, where they'll start to have intelligent agents. I'm waiting because 2025 is supposed to be the year of the intelligent agent. Still waiting for it to really be there and help me. And that will be helpful, I think. But I think the bigger issue is we're moving from, we digitize stuff, right? But now it's how are you using the data that's being collected, right? We've all heard of big data. And so we've moved from, the internet to the Internet of Things. And now we're talking about the Internet's of behavior, right? And I think actually the Internet of behavior, though it has real Orwellian Big Brother potential in one respect, right? It also has the ability to really help our students with special needs, right? So, just like right now you have a service dog that can identify potentially some issue with, somebody who's about to have a seizure. Wearable devices are going to be able to watch students and potentially identify before they act out, for instance, and really hopefully change some of the climate that we've had issues with students who have significant disability issues and have difficulty in the classroom, right? And that, I think, has potential. There's also the potential to, go too far and really, hinder students from being students. And so all of that has to be pretty balanced. And there are a lot of ethical issues that have to kind of be addressed through that. But being able to intervene in a behavior way may be better than having to just put kids on medicine, right? And so I think that next step of really digitizing or going to datization from digitization is probably where we're going, if that makes sense.
I was going to ask you quick, Steve. Have you heard of Manus yet? That one that got released like a week or two ago.
I have
It
not.
was so I just came across it. I haven't dug too much into it, but I just came across it like last week because we were putting a newsletter together. But Manus is the one that they're claiming is like the first general AI.
Okay.
I don't know what that all entails so yet, but they had like I actually have. Let me see.
Well, it's interesting, yeah, because supposedly OpenAI has an AGI tool, right, an active general intelligence tool uh, inside. Yeah. Well, and obviously these tools, right, are going to then be able to drive more intelligent tutoring,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so
Yep.
that's, I think, a real potential because small group instruction can really change, right? If the student can work with a tutor and then a teacher, because there's still a need for human agency, all right? No matter what I say, don't interpret that to say that we want to get rid of the human teacher. We've been trying to do that since the 1500s, right? People have a book now. All the world's knowledge is at their fingertips, right? There's a old article called "Technology is Messiah" that was in Education Digest from like September of 1993 or 94, I think 94, that talked about the fact that, this was a speech originally that the University of Trier president gave at the beginning of the school year in like the 1560s. And I don't believe if it really did because I've never seen the original document, but it's a great urban legend that we've been dealing with this issue forever. We're not going to get rid of teachers, right? There still needs to be a human to say, hey, this works, this doesn't work. But the ability to offload some of the repetitive tasks to a tool, that seems pretty exciting.
Yeah. So one of the things that you talk about is definitely this role of technology. That especially that I liked how you had said it's not a supplemental thing now; it's becoming a core, essential thing in order for delivering of instruction, right? And so then to me, something that is, I think, also a really important component that needs to go along with that is the digital literacy piece, right? If this is going to be a core essential thing that our teachers and our students are going to need to have, what do you see as kind of the important characteristics of that digital literacy that we should be providing?
That's an excellent question, right? And in fact, I've been thinking about that ever since David approached me about speaking on that topic in August, right? And I don't have a great answer yet, right? I still have a lot of potential, right? There's somebody just posted here the 7 literacies that people need to go forward, talk about, but it's definitely more than the tech skills, right? It's how do you build the critical thinking? As I've spoken to people about assessment, for instance, I've talked about really flipping Bloom back to the original version of Bloom, right? Which has, creating is now at the top of Bloom. Well, the generative AI tools can do all the creating you want. So we need to go back to analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And those are sort of the key focus, I would say, going forward for assessment, right? If AI can generate the answer, it's probably not a good test question, right? And we know lots of people spend lots of time trying to figure out how to make kids not cheat at all levels, right? From kindergarten all the way up. But the issue is, how do they use those tools effectively to enhance the evaluation, synthesis, and analysis so they get good materials based on what's out there and can be generated, right? Like you guys probably aren't quite as chronologically hindered as I am at this point, but you don't have the issue of, when I went to the library to do my my composition paper as a junior, we were excited to find a couple of sources, right? I used to say I could have, today I could do my composition on 17th century book making or boot making or whatever. And, I'd find 1,000 articles plus videos on how to do it in about 10 minutes. So it's the issue of how to go through cull and the critical thinking and media literacy to really identify these are the most important resources, right? They're supported. They're from good, reputable journals or, people, professionals in their areas, not When we used to look for information on wolves, right, for a biology assignment, I'd say, if you find Bob's, lycanthrope website, don't give that a lot of credibility. Now, and I'm not trying to diss the werewolf people among us, but, that's not a great resource probably. Same concept, right? Look for where those sources are coming. And the other issue is, how do you integrate that digital literacy all through the curriculum? Right. So it should never be a separate kind of thing. It has to be totally integrated. Again, another opportunity to really use those library staff and get them in there and make sure that they're helping people find information effectively, because their job is more important. Now we think, oh, get the internet. Why do we need librarians? Well, because there's too much information out there. They have to help you sort it. For my graduate students all the time, a great shout out to Kendall Larson and the rest of the library staff at Winona State. They are fabulous to help my students get through all the information and find what they need. But they have a set of skills that every student isn't getting exposed to, and they really need to be, right? And then the key beyond that is, okay, from digital literacy, how does that incorporate what we really need to know about cultural literacy, right? And that was one thing that survey I mentioned before about educators and AI. I was amazed how many people responded from the K-12 world, well, our district doesn't let us use those tools. And I'd love to know who the individual is, so if they're listening to here, please reach out to me. There was an Ojibwe teacher who was talking about the fact that, nothing her students try to do with the language comes up properly in AI because there's such a small group of materials to train from, right? And so how is that going to have an impact on indigenous languages? And how are we to keep those cultures engaged as well in a world that's, I was in Iceland last summer and everybody speaks English and every student does. And they're like, well, because of the internet, right? And so we got to figure out how we're going to manage those other cultures. And I think digital literacy now has to be more encompassing of all of that process.
Yeah, I think it totally does. Otherwise, I think we run the risk here, especially as we progress with AI, of, further expanding that digital divide. And it's not just along, economic lines necessarily or racial lines, but it could be culturally here as well, And I think you hit on a really good point there.
Yeah, I like the point you brought up too, Steve, about there's just an overwhelming amount of sources and things available to us that it kind of reminds me of like the too many choices paradox, like consumer paralysis. Like you go to the store and there's just so many options that you don't know what to get, but it's more like we have so many sources available to us, and it's more so sifting through to find ones that are actually valuable sources. And you crediting the library at this university there with how important.
Well, and they are essential to the process, right? And especially now, as you see so many summary tools that are out there on the internet, and like the deep search tool that's part of Gemini, right? That'll go out and do the searches for you. Okay, how are they doing it? So, for instance, being the same survey results, I had them in SurveyMonkey, and I was going through, and I asked it to identify, what things were statistically significant. And that made my life easier because I didn't have to test every statistic, right? But when I went actually back and did the statistical calculations, they didn't always agree with what the AI tool told me, right? So I'm like, okay, the AI tools, again, that they're all black boxes kind of, right? So you have to really be able to step back and know to check, right? And go back to traditional tools to do that work. And I think that's going to be the biggest, step forward of how do we continue to get people to look at those tools and not just say, well, I can do it with AI, so I don't need to learn how. Similar to like 100 years ago when what you see is what you can get. HTML editors came out, right? When I first learned HTML, I did it in basically a Word document or a text file. And I always told people we should still teach that way first, because if they don't learn those tools, right, if they don't learn to actually code, then when they have a problem with the editors, they're not going to be able to clean stuff up. And I still find that today in our LMS, that there'll be an HTML line that I can just go in and clean out, but most of my peers couldn't because they never learned the basic coding of how to do that. Right. And so that's definitely, as we look at digital literacy, how much coding does have to be involved, right? You don't have to be an expert, and especially with AI, right? The problem is you have to know enough to know how to ask AI to help you with the code, right? I mean, it'll take a good coder and make you great and fast. It will not take somebody who's not a coder and turn them into a computer scientist.
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue too, just with the AI conversation. Because like there's some schools where I've gone to multiple times, and it's definitely the case that we're in this area where we have to keep up with the advancements of AI, and for teachers, professional development in any area where they're attending like PE days or their basic trainings at start of the year, like there are always new things that they need to be aware of. But like AI is moving so quickly that to keep them all up on the advancements is kind of difficult. And I would say that the schools that I've been to that we've done some trainings for, I do feel like the ones that have had us multiple times are at an advantage, because then they're more aware of some of the recent things that have occurred. Whereas, some schools we maybe went to one time and they're still in kind of that introductory area. So with knowing that, with the AI advancements, do you see where there's like, regardless of where you're at, so if you're a school that's kind of still in that introductory phase, or if you're in, you've had a couple different trainings, you've been introduced to some tools, do you think that there are practical steps that every school can take to make sure that teachers are prepared to integrate AI in some fashion?
Well, I think, not just AI, but in general, right? Any good training goes back to the original point. Make sure any new technology you're using is going to be a positive instructional or administrative tool, right? So figure out what is the concern you have, right? So one of the early things a lot of people have used, like the phraseology tools and the paraphrasing tools that are there in AI, with either like Magic School, Quillbot, or a couple that I can think of offhand that I've used in examples, to take something that is difficult maybe for a high school student who's got some reading disabilities and re-level the text for them, right? That's a very simple thing people can use and say, hey, I'm using this, and then maybe expand from it, right? And give people small things that they can be successful with and say, hey, yeah, this is very useful, and then move forward. And so just have access, because that's why I'm a little concerned about the districts that the teachers are saying, hey, well, they're not going to let us use AI tools. That's great, but the kids are still going to use them. The key is they're going to either use them under their own direction or your direction and guidance. And I would prefer that the educators provide direction and guidance, right? And kind of help them do what they need to do. And so I think the biggest step is give people the ability to be successful, provide that foundation for everybody. But then when you have your pioneers, give them the ability to push forward, right? But that doesn't mean, and I can think of one example. I was trying to get geography software into a library a long time ago. And the principal and all the central office people were pretty sick of me by that time with my hand out looking for things. So I went to one of the geography teachers he was retiring like in a year, right? He'd been there like 30 some years. He was the union grievance chair. So he was somebody, when he walked in the principal's office, he usually got attention. And I just went down and kind of told him, hey, these are the potential things we could do with this software. And then I just walked away, right? Next thing you know, the principal's coming to me going, Neil wants this geography software. What do we need to do to make it happen, right? It worked, right? So go to those people who are really good teachers, right? Because everybody would agree Neil was a great teacher. And it really worked out well. I take a lot of pride in the fact that he was going to retire and just move to Arizona. And because he got so excited about the things technology could do for his students, instead of that, he actually went down there and worked as a student teacher supervisor for Arizona State, right? So we didn't lose him to the profession. We got him excited about, hey, there are new things here. There's new potential. And he was helped to guide an entire new group of teachers into the profession. And so you got to provide for kind of everybody where they are. It's just like we ask teachers to differentiate for our students. Administrators and leaders have to differentiate for their teachers, right? What do you need to move you to the next step? And we often do that base, but then we don't go farther than that. So a few people figure it out on their own, but the majority lose a lot of potential because there isn't that systemic plan, right? In a perfect world, every single teacher would have an individual professional development plan, right? Just like Carlton Washburn is mentioned in Salman Khan's book, The One World Schoolhouse. But I actually worked in the high school district that the Winnetka students moved into. And that Winnetka plan was every student had an individual plan on what they were going to do. And they still do to this day. They started in the 30s. They still have it today. But that's what we should have for every student, theoretically, right? And you can't do that necessarily. But I do think if we look back at what the progressive educators wanted in the 1920s and 30s, the technology that exists now can really help us move to a lot of that work. So a lot of things that, John Dewey and Carlton Washburn and those folks talked about wasn't possible necessarily without massive amounts of time. Today, because of technology, we might be able to do more of those things. And so I think it's really time to go back and look at those folks and look at what were their thoughts and how can we potentially implement those to make sure that, nothing should be a one-shot PD kind of thing. Make sure our teachers are really getting long sustained support.
You look a little bit at school leadership. You've talked a little bit about educators too, but also let's touch a little bit on students or students and staff. How do you think we can get our educational institutions to kind of build up some of that digital resilience? And by that, what I mean, getting people to critically evaluate the information, the sources that it comes from, with the idea of helping to combat misinformation, disinformation, because I think even in this world of generative AI that we're in, it's becoming even more difficult to sometimes tell the real from the fake, the authentic from the created.
It definitely is. And again, one person's fake news is another person's solid fact, right? Because we live in this post-truth world where every fact can be argued, right? And so getting people to look at things and try to look in a non-biased perspective is, maybe it's more important just to identify, hey, what are the biases of whoever's providing this information? And then look at that and say, okay, now where do you want to come down sometimes? Because I'm not sure we can even 100% of the time identify this is actually the fact. One thing I always tell my graduate students, when they give you one statistic, one number, always be very wary, right? Because then the question is, okay, how does that relate to anything else? So if they don't give you something to relate it to, where to get to, it's practice. And we have to teach our students at all levels to actually make difficult decisions, right? And give them the opportunity to fail and learn from failure, right? We've sort of become overprotective of now, like, well, everybody has to get a good grade and we got to make sure there's no failure, because then when they get to college, especially if they go to a larger university that has a lot of, seminar classes that grade on curves, they're going to get hit in the face with failure in a way that never happened in their K-12 environment, right? And so you got to give people the opportunity to fail and learn from those mistakes and build that experience and take a look over time at, okay, where, what's a good source? What's a good source for me that works, right? And that's just a repetitive task. And at least now you have all of these materials, right? When I was a classroom teacher, they was talking about trying to bring the classroom, the real world into the classroom. Well, it's pouring in now in a digital wave. We just got to figure out how to take that data and use it effectively. So the more real world examples we can provide students and real problems they can solve, as opposed to just, the simple answers that are in the back of the textbook. And the answers for all those textbooks are online, right? So students can go find them. So you got to really work to develop good questions that require a little extra work.
I think some of it too comes down to educators needing to be able to model situations from their own real personal experience where either they've fallen victim to some of that, I fell for a trap and what I thought I shared turned out to be false, and then, model then the steps that you took to try to correct your action, right? And to admit the vulnerability of it and like be human about it.
I remember a teacher with a master's degree coming in one day and saying, "Hey, I got this email from a soldier in Afghanistan, and he's got this money he wants to move to the U.S., but he needs my bank account to transfer it." And I'm like, "Have you not ever heard of the Nigerian princess?" "Well, yeah, but that's different. This is a soldier." And I'm like, "Oh, good grief. We might have to have some more training, right?" But, phishing there's tons of stuff out there. And so you just have to, the more you can be honest and open with your students and walk them through, I think the better off you are.
Yeah, and that's something that we touched on a little bit earlier, but in given the digital literacy areas, and thinking about there's some really good programs that cover all different aspects of digital citizenship, like some of the things you brought up, like identifying good sources for news, is the information correct, cross-checking that, combating misinformation, those type of things. And then another component, which you just mentioned, is like some of the cybersecurity issues and being aware of those.
All right. So, Steve, if you could give one piece of advice to educators looking to future-proof, whatever future-proof means, right? Their teaching strategies with technology, what would that be?
Yeah, you can't future-proof. Okay. I spent the 90s and the early 2000s working in IT where everybody was trying to future-proof everything. It doesn't work, right? There's always going to be technology that changes. And the nice thing is there's usually software that'll backfill and make the hardware work anyway, right? And so you can't future-proof things, instruction any more than you can future-proof the network. You have to focus on some things, and a lot of that depends upon your sort of educational philosophy, right? If you're a perennialist, if you're an essentialist, if you're sort of a realist, that's going to drive what you think is really important. But there are core concepts of literacy that everybody needs to know, right? Everybody needs to know how to read, write, and calculate. Exactly the tools they use to do that may differ, right? But they're going to have to learn how to do those things. Just make sure that you have a solid instructional core and your student learning objectives they focus on those higher levels of Bloom, right? And all instruction's kind of situational too, because you're going to have a different group of students every time in those desks looking at you. And so what can you do to make sure they learn how to learn, right? I used to carpool with a physics teacher who ultimately became a superintendent as well. And I'd always laugh at Brian and say, every day, you're teaching people things that are wrong, right? Because if you remember back to like when I was in chemistry, we learned the electron was the smallest thing on Earth, right? Now we know there's a whole bunch of smaller things and maybe even smaller things, right? And so the key in chemistry wasn't that I learned about the electron and neutron and the plum pudding model of the atom. I learned about the scientific method. Right. So you learned how to learn. And in literature and in history and the arts, you learn, the internal and external criticism when you're looking at a document, right? How to really determine what it was saying and in the context it was given. And so those are the key things that I think it's important to learn how to learn how to find information. Those are the real keys. Those are going to remain consistent, I think, depending upon whatever happens with digitization and our AI tutors potentially and other things. And they're going to work whether or not you unplug your computer or not.
So what you're talking about here is, not future-proofing with technology, but future-proofing by having that solid basis and that solid foundation.
I'm sure when slide rules came out, there were a group of engineers and physicists who thought they were terrible things and that students wouldn't learn how to do logarithms properly anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, Steve, I I wanted to just kind of plug here. We're very excited to have you come join us for our EdTech Connect 2025 conference. And I know you and I have talked a bit back and forth, and you were going to do a keynote for us that really focuses on digital literacy for 2030. And so I was hoping you could almost kind of preview for us what that might look like and attendees will take away from that keynote when we have the conference.
Well, clearly you don't understand my process, because I'll have that presentation done probably a couple hours before I give it. Not that I haven't already started, but as I walk my dog, he gives me a lot of good advice about, well, don't include that, include this
Sure.
now as well, right? In fact, a couple of my students have suggested they're going to steal that from me and start talking about, well, when I was walking my dog or my cat and I talked about this. Because you kind of got to let it percolate for a long time. But the key is we've had technology for a long time. And Jeremy and I were talking before you logged in and we started. Socrates was upset about writing because all scholars were going to lose their memory. They weren't going to be brilliant. It was going to ruin scholarship. That it's always been that way. I think one is, what are those core key literacy tools that people need, right? Besides the reading, writing, and arithmetic, kind of what are those abilities to really determine information in the critical thinking theories that align with that, how to search and find stuff, right? And then sort of how to cull the wheat from the chaff of all the information that's there. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is, how do we look at STEM in relation to generative AI now, right? We've had this huge push for STEM for such a long time. And I've always been, in full disclosure, as a history guy, I've always been a little unhappy about STEM because it pushes out the one thing that I think that sets the context for everything, which is history, right? The same science teacher I used to drive with, we always thought in a perfect world we'd get to teach a class about the history of science, right? Because all of these science things all were in context, and how did they change the world, right? Not just the knowledge. And so how do we put things in context more effectively so that we can look at things, as we span cultural groups and look at global, issues, how do they impact to what's going on, for me today where I am, right? And so there's a lot, I think, with literacy that has to go beyond just using technology tools effectively, but understanding the context in which they live.
Great. Well, yeah, we're very excited to have you join us. And
Yeah, and I've applied to present at that conference breakout session. So as long as someone approves my sessions, then
You think you might know somebody?
I hope I have an in. So we'll see.
You never know.
Well, Steve, we definitely loved having you here today. Is there anything that you would like to plug, or can I share your socials?
Yeah, you can definitely, show my Twitter account. LinkedIn is probably one of the best ways to get a hold of me. I have a website, or just through my email at Winona State, which is just sball@winona.edu. So it's been my pleasure, gentlemen. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you all in a couple months.
thanks, Steve.
Bye-bye.
For those listening, watching, be sure that you don't miss out on the opportunity to network with other educators. Myself, Jeremy, will be at the conference, even though he still said he needs to get approved. We'll have a really great conference that's going on August 7th for EdTech Connect 2025, and that's in Worthington, Minnesota. And Steve will join us. You can earn CEUs at the event, attend Steve's keynote on digital literacy for 2030, and we'll have a wide range of breakout sessions, both in the EdTech area and some continuing education requirements. So we're very excited for that, and we hope you join us for that. So.
And as always, thanks to all of you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode of this great conversation that we had with Steve. At the same time, don't forget to like and subscribe, share what you like from our channel with other educators, and grow our own network here. So remember, stay curious, stay innovative, and we'll see you next time.